Episode 1. Before Rome, the world that created an empire. Before Rome became an empire, before emperors wore purple, before legions marched across Europe, Africa, and Asia, there was a river. There were hills. There were villages made of wood, mud, straw, smoke, and stone. There were farmers watching the seasons, shepherds guiding animals across rough land, merchants moving salt, bronze, pottery, wine, and stories, priests reading signs in the sky, and warriors standing on hilltops, looking across valleys, wondering which neighboring village would become a friend, and which one would become an enemy. Rome did not begin as marble. Rome did not begin as empire. Rome began as a small settlement in central Italy, in a landscape shaped by geography, trade, fear, migration, religion, and memory. And if we want to understand the Roman Empire, we must begin before Rome, because no empire appears from nothing. Every empire is born inside a world that already exists, and Rome was created by that world. This is Episode 1, Before Rome, the world that created an empire. Part 1, a Mediterranean world in motion. To understand Rome, we must first look at the Mediterranean, not as a map of separate countries the way we see it today, but as an ancient sea of movement. The Mediterranean was not a wall between civilizations, it was a road. Ships crossed it before written Roman history began. Traders moved from island to island, from coast to coast, carrying metal, grain, oil, wine, weapons, cloth, and ideas. A clay pot could travel farther than a king. A religious symbol could cross the sea before an army did. An alphabet could move from one people to another, changing every civilization it touched. Long before Rome became powerful, the Mediterranean was already full of older civilizations. To the east, there were the Greeks, with their city-states, temples, myths, poetry, and colonies. Farther east, there were the Phoenicians, master sailors and traders from the Levant, who carried goods and writing systems across the sea. In North Africa, Carthage would grow into one of the greatest maritime powers of the ancient world. And in Italy itself, there were many peoples, many languages, and many local cultures. The future Romans were not alone. They were not the first civilized people of Italy. They were not even the most impressive people of Italy in the beginning. The early Romans were one small Latin-speaking community among many, and this is one of the most important lessons in Roman history. Rome became great partly because it learned from others. It borrowed, adapted, copied, absorbed, and then slowly transformed what it had borrowed into something Roman. The early Romans did not invent everything from nothing. They inherited a world. They stood at the meeting point of older traditions. Their genius was not purity, their genius was combination. In the centuries before Rome's rise, the Mediterranean had already passed through deep change. Older palace societies in the eastern Mediterranean had weakened or collapsed. Trade networks shifted, populations moved, warfare changed. New communities appeared, old powers faded. The world entered a new age of smaller kingdoms, rising cities, and expanding trade. Italy was part of this transformation. It was not empty. It was not waiting silently for Rome. It was alive. In the north and center, communities developed around agriculture, metalworking, and local aristocracies. In the south, Greek colonies brought new forms of art, writing, religion, and urban life. On the western sea routes, Phoenician and later Carthaginian traders connected Italy to North Africa, Spain, Sardinia, Sicily, and the wider Mediterranean. And in central Italy, one civilization would become especially important for Rome's early development, the Etruscans. But before we reach them, we must first understand the land itself, because Rome's story begins with geography. Part 2. Italy before Rome. The Italian peninsula stretches into the Mediterranean like a long bridge. It points towards Sicily. It touches the world of Greece. It faces North Africa across the sea. It connects the western Mediterranean to the eastern Mediterranean. This position mattered. Italy was not isolated, it was central. Its mountains, plains, rivers, and coastlines shaped the lives of its peoples long before Rome became a city. The Apennine Mountains run down the spine of Italy. They divide regions, create valleys, and make movement difficult but not impossible. This geography helped create many local identities. Ancient Italy was not one unified country. It was a mosaic of peoples: Latins, Sabines, Etruscans, Umbrians, Samnites, Volsci, Aequi, Oscans, Greek settlers, Phoenician and Carthaginian traders, and many smaller communities whose names survive only faintly through archaeology, inscriptions, or later Roman memory. Among these peoples, the Latins lived in Latium, a region of west-central Italy. Latium was not the richest region in the Mediterranean. It was not the largest. It was not the most famous. But it had something powerful: position. Latium sat between Etruria to the north and Greek-influenced southern Italy to the south. It was close to the sea, but not directly exposed to pirates in the same way a coastal town might be. It was crossed by paths of trade and movement, and through it ran the Tiber River. The Tiber was one of the keys to Rome's future. A river is never just water. A river is a road, a border, a source of food, a line of defense, and a link between inland farmers and coastal traders. Rome's future site stood near a crossing point of the Tiber. This mattered deeply. Where people can cross a river, they gather. Where they gather, they trade. Where they trade, they build markets. Where they build markets, they need rules. Where they need rules, power begins. Rome's hills also mattered. The famous 7 hills were not originally one grand city. In the beginning, they were separate high places, useful for defense, settlement, and visibility. The Palatine Hill in particular became central to Rome's foundation memory. Archaeology shows early settlement in this area, with huts made of simple materials: wood, straw, mud, and wattle and daub. This was not the Rome of emperors. This was not the Rome of marble temples. This was a world of small houses, animals, storage spaces, hearth smoke, and family groups. The valley that later became the Roman Forum was originally low, wet, and marshy. It was not automatically a political center. It had to be transformed. For the Forum to become the heart of Rome, human beings had to reshape nature. They had to drain water, raise ground levels, organize labor, move burial areas, and create a shared public space. This is one of the first great themes of Roman history. Rome was built by turning difficulty into structure. A marsh became a forum. A cluster of villages became a city. A local people became a republic. A republic became an empire. But in the beginning, all of that was still far away. The people of early Rome lived in a world of neighboring villages and local rivalries. They fought for land. They made alliances through marriage. They honored household gods. They watched the sky for signs. They remembered ancestors. They told stories about heroes. And gradually these scattered communities began to join together. Rome was not simply founded in one magical day. The traditional date, 753 BC, belongs to Roman memory and later calculation. The deeper truth is that Rome emerged over time. It grew from settlement to city, from hilltop huts to public spaces, from local chiefs to kings, from clans to institutions. Part 3. The Etruscans, Rome's first great teachers. North of Rome lay Etruria, the land of the Etruscans. To the early Romans, the Etruscans were not primitive neighbors. They were powerful, urban, wealthy, religious, artistic, and mysterious. Even today, the Etruscans keep some of their mystery because their language was not Latin, not Greek, and not part of the same Indo-European family. We can read many Etruscan inscriptions, but understanding the language fully remains difficult. Yet archaeology tells us a great deal. The Etruscans built cities. They made rich tombs. They produced metalwork, pottery, sculpture, and wall paintings. They traded widely. They absorbed influences from Greece and the Near East. Their aristocratic culture was filled with banquets, rituals, symbols of rank, and elaborate funerary practices. Their world was not a single empire ruled by one king. It was a network of city-states, Veii, Tarquinia, Cerveteri, Vulci, and others. These cities competed, traded, worshipped, fought, and formed alliances. They were close enough to influence Rome profoundly. In the early centuries, Rome was not looking down on Etruria. Rome was looking up. The Etruscans influenced Roman religion, politics, symbols of authority, architecture, and perhaps even the nature of kingship. Roman tradition remembered some of its later kings as having Etruscan connections, especially the Tarquins. Whether every detail of these royal stories is historically secure is another question, but the memory itself matters. The Romans remembered their early city as being shaped by Etruscan power. From the Etruscans, Rome inherited or adapted important symbols: the fasces, bundles of rods associated with authority; the curule chair, a seat connected with high office; the purple-bordered toga, worn by important officials; and certain forms of religious divination. The Romans learned to think of public power as something that needed sacred approval. In Rome, politics and religion were never completely separate. Before a battle, before an election, before a major decision, Romans wanted to know whether the gods approved. The sky mattered, birds mattered, lightning mattered. The liver of a sacrificed animal could matter. To a modern mind, this may seem strange, but to the ancient Romans, religion was not only private belief, it was public order. The gods were part of the state, and many of Rome's techniques for reading divine signs were deeply connected to Etruscan religious knowledge. The Etruscans also influenced Roman building. Early Rome's great projects, especially those associated with the later monarchy, reflect a movement toward urban life. Drainage works, public spaces, temples, and monumental architecture. One of the most important early projects was the development of the Forum Valley and the great drainage system remembered as the Cloaca Maxima. Another was the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill, traditionally associated with the last kings of Rome. This temple would become one of the central religious symbols of the Roman state. Think about what this means. Rome's future power was not only military, it was ceremonial, architectural, religious, and institutional. The Romans learned how to make power visible. A city is not only walls and houses, a city is also symbols. The Etruscans helped Rome understand that. Part 4. The Greeks in Italy: Myth, Art, and the Alphabet. Long before Rome conquered Greece, Greece came to Italy. Beginning in the early 1st millennium BC, Greek settlers established colonies across southern Italy and Sicily. This region became known to later Romans as Magna Graecia, meaning Greater Greece. Cities such as Cumae, Neapolis, Tarentum, Sybaris, Croton, and Syracuse became centers of Greek language, religion, trade, art, and political culture. For early Rome, Greek influence did not arrive only after conquest. It was already present in Italy. Greek pottery moved through trade. Greek myths traveled with merchants and settlers. Greek gods were identified with local gods. Greek artistic styles influenced Etruscan and Italic art. Greek writing influenced the Etruscan alphabet, and through Etruscan adaptation, helped shape the Latin alphabet. This is one of the quiet revolutions behind Roman history. The Romans would become famous for law, administration, inscriptions, literature, and record-keeping. But the tools of writing reached them through contact. The alphabet itself was part of a long chain of cultural transmission. Phoenician writing influenced Greek writing. Greek writing influenced Etruscan writing. Etruscan writing influenced early Latin writing. So when we look at Roman inscriptions, Roman law, Roman literature, and eventually the Latin language that shaped Europe for centuries, we are seeing the result of a long Mediterranean conversation. Rome's voice was never alone. It was made from many voices. The Greeks also gave Rome stories. One of the most important was the legend of Aeneas. According to later Roman tradition, Aeneas was a Trojan hero who survived the destruction of Troy and journeyed west. His descendants would eventually be connected to the birth of Romulus and Remus. This myth gave Rome something precious, a place inside the heroic world of Greek epic. Rome could say, "We are not just a small Latin town. We are connected to Troy. We are connected to destiny. We are connected to the ancient suffering and survival of heroes." This story became especially important much later, when Roman poets and emperors wanted to present Rome's rise as part of divine history. But the roots of that idea belong to the deep contact between Italy and the Greek world. The Greeks also showed what city life could look like. Their colonies had temples, marketplaces, civic identities, and political traditions. The Roman city did not simply copy the Greek polis. Rome developed its own path. But the presence of Greek cities in southern Italy meant that Romans lived near examples of advanced urban culture. They could see stone temples, they could encounter Greek goods, they could hear Greek stories, they could learn that a city could be more than a settlement. A city could be a world. Part 5. Phoenicians, Carthage, and the Western Sea. While Greece influenced southern Italy, another power was shaping the Western Mediterranean, the Phoenicians, and later Carthage. The Phoenicians were among the great sailors of the ancient world. From cities such as Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos in the eastern Mediterranean, they moved westward across the sea. They founded trading posts and colonies. They connected distant coasts. They helped spread alphabetic writing. They traded in metals, luxury goods, dyes, timber, and many other products. One of their most important colonies was Carthage in North Africa. Carthage began as a Phoenician foundation, but over time it grew into a major power in its own right. By the time Rome was still developing in central Italy, Carthage was already becoming a great force in the Western Mediterranean. This matters because Rome's future enemy was already being created. Long before the Punic Wars, long before Hannibal crossed the Alps, long before Roman armies fought for Sicily, Spain, and North Africa, the Western Mediterranean was already a competitive world of trade routes, colonies, naval power, and cultural exchange. Carthage, the Greeks, the Etruscans, and the peoples of Italy all belonged to this connected sea. Rome's later expansion cannot be understood without this earlier world. The Mediterranean was not empty space waiting for Roman conquest. It was crowded, active, and dangerous. Every coast had interests, every island mattered. Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica were not just places on a map. They were strategic positions, stepping stones across the sea, and future prizes of war. But in this early period, Rome was still small. The great Carthaginian and Greek maritime networks were beyond Rome's direct control. Yet their existence shaped the world into which Rome was born. Rome would eventually become a land power that learned to become a sea power. But before that transformation, Rome was still learning how to become a city. And for that, we return to Latium. Part 6. Latium, the small world of the Latins. The Latins were one of the Italic peoples of central Italy. They spoke Latin or early forms of it. They lived in small communities across Latium. They shared language, religious practices, and certain cultural traditions, but they were not one unified nation in the modern sense. Rome was one Latin community among others. Nearby places such as Alba Longa, Lavinium, and other Latin settlements appear in Roman tradition as part of Rome's early memory. The Romans imagined their origins through these places. Lavinium was connected with Aeneas. Alba Longa was connected with the royal line before Romulus and Remus. Rome placed itself within a family of Latin communities, but also claimed a special destiny. This is important because early Rome's identity was both local and ambitious. It belonged to Latium, but it dreamed beyond Latium. At first, Rome's struggles were local: conflicts with neighboring peoples, competition for land, raids, cattle, marriage alliances, religious festivals, border disputes, and small wars that later Roman historians would turn into grand stories. But these small conflicts mattered. They trained Rome in survival. They forced Rome to organize. They taught Rome diplomacy. They made Rome think constantly about allies, enemies, and incorporation. One of the most important features of Roman history is that Rome often expanded by absorbing outsiders. Defeated peoples could become allies. Allies could become citizens. Foreign gods could be welcomed. Foreign customs could be adapted. This habit did not appear overnight. It may have roots in Rome's early position as a mixed community, placed between different peoples, trade routes, and cultures. Rome was never simply one thing. Even its foundation myth suggests mixture. Romulus does not create a pure city. He opens an asylum. He receives outsiders, fugitives, and displaced men. Then the story of the Sabine women explains the merging of Roman and Sabine communities. These stories are legendary, not straightforward history, but they reveal something about how Romans understood themselves. They believed their city grew by absorbing others, and that idea would become one of the secrets of Roman power. Rome could conquer, but Rome could also include. Not always equally, not always kindly, not always peacefully, but more effectively than many ancient rivals. The empire was still centuries away, but the pattern was beginning. Part 7. Romulus, Remus, and the power of legend. Every civilization tells stories about its beginning. These stories are rarely simple facts. They are mirrors. They show what a people wants to believe about itself. Rome's most famous foundation story is the story of Romulus and Remus, twin brothers, children of Mars, descendants of a royal line, thrown into danger as infants, saved by the Tiber, nursed by a she-wolf, raised by a shepherd, and destined to found a city. Then they are divided by rivalry. Remus dies. Romulus becomes the first king. Rome is born through survival, violence, divine ancestry, and brotherly blood. This myth is dark, and that darkness matters. Rome did not imagine its foundation as peaceful. It imagined its birth through conflict. The first Roman victory was over a brother. The first wall was marked by death. The first king was also a killer. For later Romans, this story explained something profound about their city. Rome was blessed by the gods, but it was also stained by violence. Rome was destined for greatness, but greatness had a cost. Rome was a family, but family could become civil war. When we reach the later history of Rome, this myth will echo again and again. Romulus and Remus will reappear symbolically in the struggles of Roman politics, brother against brother, citizen against citizen, general against general, Caesar against Pompey, Octavian against Antony. The myth of Rome's birth already contains the tragedy of Rome's future. But historians must be careful. The story of Romulus and Remus is not the same as archaeology. The traditional date of Rome's founding, 753 BC, became famous because later Romans accepted it as the city's birthday. But Rome's actual development was gradual. Archaeology shows early settlement on the hills. It shows changes in burial patterns. It shows increasing social complexity. It shows movement toward urban organization. It shows that Rome emerged from real communities in central Italy. The legend gives meaning. The archaeology gives evidence. To understand early Rome, we need both. We do not throw the legend away, but we do not treat it as simple fact. We ask why Romans told this story, what values it reveals, what anxieties it hides, and what memory it preserves. In the story of Romulus, we see war, leadership, asylum, boundaries, divine approval, and the dangerous power of ambition. These would become Roman themes for centuries. Part 8. Religion before empire. Before Rome had emperors, it had gods. Before Rome ruled provinces, it performed rituals. Before Roman armies marched under imperial standards, Roman priests watched signs and guarded sacred traditions. Religion in early Rome was not only about personal faith, it was about maintaining peace with the gods. If the gods were honored correctly, the community could prosper. If rituals were neglected, disaster might follow. This religious mindset shaped Roman politics and military life. A Roman leader was not only a commander, he had sacred responsibilities. A public decision required divine approval. A battle might depend not only on weapons, but on omens. Priests, augurs, and ritual specialists held real importance. The Romans were practical people, but their practicality included religion. They did not see a contradiction. To build a road, organize a census, declare war, or dedicate a temple, all of these could belong to the same world of order. This is another reason Rome became powerful. It linked the sacred and the political. It made institutions feel ancient. It made public life ceremonial. It gave authority a religious language. And again, we see outside influence. Etruscan religious expertise was especially respected in matters of divination and ritual interpretation. Greek gods and myths entered Roman religion over time. Local Italic traditions remained important. Rome's religion, like Rome itself, was layered. It was not created in one moment. It accumulated. This accumulation gave Roman identity great flexibility. Rome could meet a foreign god and find a place for that god. Rome could face a new people and interpret them through existing religious categories. Rome could expand without feeling that every foreign influence destroyed Roman identity. Instead, Rome often made foreign things Roman. The gods of Rome, like the people of Rome, belonged to a world of mixture, adaptation, and memory. Part 9. The First Kings and the Making of a City. Roman tradition says that before the Republic, Rome was ruled by 7 kings: Romulus, Numa Pompilius, Tullus Hostilius, Ancus Marcius, Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, Servius Tullius, and Lucius Tarquinius Superbus. The details of these kings are difficult for historians. Many stories were written down centuries later. They mix memory, myth, moral lesson, political propaganda, and perhaps fragments of real tradition. But the king list still matters because it shows how Romans imagined the stages of their own development. Romulus gives Rome war, foundation, and political beginning. Numa gives religion, ritual, and sacred order. Tullus Hostilius gives military expansion. Ancus Marcius combines war, religion, and infrastructure. Tarquinius Priscus brings Etruscan influence, public works, and royal display. Servius Tullius is associated with social organization, census, and military classification. Tarquinius Superbus becomes the arrogant tyrant whose fall leads to the Republic. Whether each story is historically accurate is less important than what the sequence teaches. The Romans believed their city needed several ingredients: war, religion, law, infrastructure, social order, military organization, public authority, and resistance to tyranny. The monarchy, in Roman memory, was both necessary and dangerous. Kings built the city, but kings also threatened liberty. This tension would shape the Roman Republic after 509 BC. Romans would hate the title of king. They would fear one-man rule. And yet, centuries later, they would create emperors who held powers greater than kings. That contradiction is one of the central dramas of Roman history. But in episode 1, we are still before the Republic. We are watching the ingredients gather: the land, the river, the hills, the Latin villages, the Etruscan cities, the Greek colonies, the Phoenician traders, the myths, the rituals, the kings, the marsh becoming a forum, and the huts becoming a city. Rome is not yet an empire, but the conditions of empire are forming. Part 10. Why Rome could happen. So why did Rome happen here? Why not another Latin town? Why not an Etruscan city? Why not a Greek colony in southern Italy? There is no single answer. History rarely has one cause. Rome happened because several advantages came together. First, geography. Rome stood near the Tiber crossing, close enough to the sea for trade, far enough inland for protection. Its hills gave defense, its river gave movement. Its position connected Latium and Etruria. Second, cultural contact. Rome was close to stronger civilizations without being completely swallowed by them. It could learn from Etruscans, trade with Greeks, encounter Phoenician networks, compete with Latin neighbors, and adapt without disappearing. Third, social flexibility. Rome's own foundation stories emphasize outsiders, mixture, and incorporation. Whether legendary or not, these stories match a later Roman habit: the ability to absorb people and turn enemies into allies. Fourth, institution building. From early kingship to later republican offices, Rome developed a powerful instinct for organizing authority. It created offices, rituals, symbols, councils, assemblies, and military structures. Rome's power was not only in courage. Many ancient peoples were brave. Rome's power was in organization. Fifth, memory. Rome told stories about itself that gave its people a sense of destiny. Aeneas gave Rome a Trojan past. Romulus gave Rome a divine and martial birth. The kings gave Rome lessons about religion, war, order, and tyranny. These stories taught Romans who they were supposed to be. Destiny is not a historical force by itself, but belief in destiny can become a force. Rome's greatness was not inevitable. It could have failed many times. It could have remained a small town. It could have been destroyed by neighbors. It could have been absorbed into Etruscan power. It could have been overshadowed forever by Greek cities. But it survived. And survival, repeated over generations, became expansion. Expansion became domination. Domination became empire. Part 11. The world before the empire. When we imagine Rome, we often imagine the Colosseum, the Senate, the legions, the emperors, the roads, the aqueducts, the marble, and the Latin inscriptions. But all of that came later. Before Rome was marble, it was mud. Before Rome was law, it was custom. Before Rome was empire, it was a village among villages. Before Rome ruled the Mediterranean shaped Rome. This is the most important idea of episode 1. Rome was created before it conquered. It was created by Italy, by Latium, by the Tiber, by the hills, by the Etruscans, by the Greeks, by the Phoenicians, by trade, by fear, by religion, by memory, by geography, by violence, and by adaptation. The Romans would later present themselves as masters of the world, but in the beginning, they were students of the world. They learned from the Etruscans how power could look sacred and majestic. They learned from the Greeks how myth, writing, art, and urban culture could transform identity. They lived in a Mediterranean shaped by Phoenician and Carthaginian trade. They grew among Latin neighbors who taught them rivalry, alliance, and survival. They stood at a crossing point, both literally and historically. And from that crossing point, Rome began. Not as the greatest city on earth, not yet, but as a community with unusual possibilities, a place where different influences met, a place where settlement became city, a place where legend and archaeology overlap, a place where the future was still invisible. Imagine standing on the Palatine Hill in the 8th century BC. There is no Colosseum, no imperial palace, no triumphal arch, no Caesar, no Augustus, no Senate ruling provinces. Only huts, smoke, animals, families, a river below, other hills nearby, distant settlements watching one another, the sound of tools, the smell of fire, the fear of enemies, the prayers to gods, and the memory of ancestors. And perhaps, without anyone knowing it, the first breath of a future empire. The people living there could not see what Rome would become. They did not know that their descendants would build roads across continents. They did not know that Latin would shape languages for thousands of years. They did not know that Roman law would influence future legal systems. They did not know that their city would become a symbol of power, order, ambition, beauty, cruelty, endurance, and collapse. They were simply living, planting, trading, fighting, praying, building, and remembering. But history often begins that way, quietly, before the monuments, before the legends are written, before the world knows the name. Rome began before Rome understood itself, and that is why, to understand the Roman Empire, we must begin here. Not with emperors, not with conquest, not with glory, but with the world that created Rome. In the next episode, we will enter the age of Rome's kings. We will follow the legendary monarchy, from Romulus to Tarquinius Superbus. We will see how Romans remembered their first rulers, how religion and war shaped the early city, and how the hatred of kings became one of the deepest emotions in Roman political life. Because before Rome became a republic, it first had to become a kingdom, and before it could reject kings, it had to be built by them. This was episode 1, Before Rome, the world that created an empire. Sleep well, and remember, every empire begins long before it knows its own name.